I still remember the day I first met Rachel. She was this tall, striking blonde with a soft laugh and a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only one in the room. We'd been together 7 years by now, and in that time, she'd been my partner in every sense. Supportive, kind, always there when I needed her. My dad and I ran a horse ranch, a place we'd built from the ground up over the years. We specialized in raising thoroughbreds, the kind of horses that commanded respect on the racing tracks. It was hard work, but it was in my blood. Dad and I knew every inch of that ranch, from the stables to the old fences that needed mending every spring. And Rachel, well, she didn't shy away from it. She'd often grab her camera and take shots of the horses, capturing them in that split second where all their strength and elegance shone through. She had an eye for beauty, and I admired that about her. That summer, we took a trip down to Texas for a big racing event. It was me, Dad, and Rachel. We'd arrived a couple of days early to get the horses settled, make sure everything was in place. I'll admit, part of me was looking forward to some downtime with her. We didn't get that often, and between the work on the ranch and her photography gigs, it seemed like there was always something pulling us in different directions. The evening before the races kicked off, we decided to head out for a meal at a local place. It was a rustic kind of restaurant, designed to look like one of those old-fashioned saloons. As soon as we walked in, I could feel the atmosphere, the cowboy hats, the rough wood floors, and the sound of country music drifting from an old jukebox in the corner. Rachel loved it. She had this wide-eyed look, taking in every detail like it was something magical. She was practically buzzing as we found a spot by the bar, laughing and chatting with the locals. By the time the sun was dipping low in the sky, we'd somehow gotten ourselves caught up in conversation with a few of the ranchers who'd come in for the races too. I was enjoying myself, but I kept an eye on the clock, knowing we had an early start. Eventually, the crowd started to thin out, and I suggested we take a walk outside before calling it a night. Rachel nodded, her eyes still bright from the evening's excitement. As we stepped out into the cool Texas air, she pointed out something down the street. "Look," she whispered, a hint of awe in her voice. I turned and saw what she was looking at, a cowboy on a striking white Arabian horse. He was leaning back in the saddle, looking every bit the picture of a Western hero under the streetlight's glow. Rachel's gaze was fixed on him, and without saying a word, she drifted closer, almost mesmerized. He noticed her and gave a small nod. Then, with a lazy, confident smile, he tipped his hat and started a conversation with her, asking if she'd ever ridden a horse like his before. She shook her head, a smile tugging at her lips. I watched, feeling a strange tension creep into my chest. I wasn't the jealous type, not usually, but something about the way he was looking at her got under my skin. I decided to step in, clearing my throat and putting a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "Hey, buddy, that's my wife you're chatting up," I said, keeping my tone friendly but firm. The cowboy gave a slight shrug, his eyes flicking from me back to Rachel, who seemed a little startled by my sudden appearance. He just laughed and said, "Didn't mean any harm. Just admiring a pretty face." I pulled her away gently, and we walked back to the car in silence. I could tell Rachel was a little miffed by my interruption, but she didn't say anything. The next day was a whirlwind. One of our horses had a hoof issue, and I had to spend the entire day tracking down a vet and some antibiotics. It turned out to be a bigger ordeal than I'd anticipated, and by the time I got back, it was well past sundown. Rachel was waiting, her face lit up with excitement. "You won't believe it," she exclaimed, practically bouncing on her heels. "That cowboy from last night? He let me ride his horse today. It was amazing, Jack. So different from the horses we've got." Her enthusiasm caught me off guard. I tried to share in her joy, but something felt off. I managed a tight smile and nodded, trying to brush off the unease creeping into my chest. For the next few days, I was back and forth, hunting down supplies and working with Dad to get everything ready for the races. Rachel, meanwhile, spent most of her time on her own, wandering around the race grounds with her camera. She'd gotten friendly with a few of the other racers and their families, and I figured she was just enjoying herself. But then, a call from an old friend of mine, Mark, changed everything. He'd noticed something strange while passing by our rented trailer one night. He mentioned he hadn't seen any lights on for a couple of evenings. I brushed it off, figuring Rachel had been out late or maybe gone into town for some night photography. I told him she was fine and that Dad and I were in a nearby town, waiting on some supplies that would be arriving the next day. But as the days went on, that nagging feeling only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. When we finally made it back to the trailer, Dad headed out to tend to the horses while I went to check on Rachel. As I got closer, I noticed the trailer was quiet, too quiet. I opened the door, and what I saw inside stopped me cold. When I stepped inside the trailer, the silence was thick, almost oppressive. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I fumbled for the light switch. Flicking it on, I took in the scene before me, and my stomach twisted. Rachel lay there, sprawled on our bed, her hair tousled and her clothes disheveled. Beside her, half hidden in the shadows, was the cowboy from the other night. He looked at me, completely unfazed, his arms slung across her as if he belonged there. For a second, I just stood there, frozen in place. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, each one louder than the last. Anger, confusion, betrayal. It all hit me like a punch to the gut. Rachel's eyes opened, and when she saw me, the color drained from her face. She sat up quickly, pulling the sheets around herself, stammering something I couldn't quite catch. My fists clenched, but I held back, feeling my father's presence just outside, knowing he'd probably heard every bit of this unfolding drama. My pride told me to walk away, but my anger had me rooted to the spot. "What the hell, Rachel?" I managed to get out, my voice strained, barely holding it together. "After everything." She glanced away, unable to meet my gaze, and I could see she was scrambling for words. The cowboy just sat there, a smug grin on his face, like he found the whole thing amusing. That only made my blood boil hotter. "Jack, it's not what you think," she said weakly, her voice trembling. But the scene spoke for itself. She didn't have to say a word. My mind was racing, flashes of the last few days coming back to me. The late nights, the hushed conversations, her growing distance. It all made sense now, every damn bit of it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep my head, to not let the anger take over. "You know what, Rachel? Don't even try to explain," I muttered, turning on my heel and heading for the door. I heard her call after me, her voice desperate, but I ignored it, stepping out into the cool night air. Dad was there, leaning against the side of the trailer, his face tight with worry. He must have heard every word, seen the look on my face, because he didn't say anything. Just gave me a small nod, his silent way of letting me know he was there for me, no questions asked. We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us, thick with unspoken words. I could feel my hands shaking, the anger and betrayal coursing through me like fire. Finally, I took a deep breath, letting the night air cool my thoughts. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Rachel or that cowboy walk away from this unscathed. As the hours ticked by, I buried myself in preparations for the final race. There was a sense of determination in every step I took, a feeling that this was more than just about the race. It was about finding my footing again. Thunderbolt was ready, and I could feel his energy as I moved through my routine, grounding myself in the work. I was done with distractions, done with the weight of Rachel's betrayal hanging over me. Dad had been watching me closely all morning. He didn't say much, but I caught the way he looked at Rachel whenever she was nearby, his expression darkening. After everything he'd built with Mom, Dad had no tolerance for disloyalty. He'd built his life around the ranch, our family, and he had a hard, clear sense of right and wrong that didn't bend. After a while, Dad pulled me aside, his voice low and firm. "Son, you've got a good head on your shoulders, and you know what she did was wrong, but you also know what needs to be done." He paused, searching my face. "You can't keep letting her drag you down, Jack. It's time to set things straight." I took a breath, letting his words sink in. I'd been clinging to the hope that maybe things could go back to the way they were, but he was right. The trust was broken, shattered into pieces I couldn't see how to fit back together. Rachel had made her choice, and it was time I made mine. I looked over to where Rachel was lingering by the edge of the stalls, her eyes watching me, pleading. But the connection I once felt for her was fading, washed away by the reality of what she'd done. I turned back to Dad, nodding. I hear you, Dad. I'm done. A slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. Good. Now let's go out there and finish what we came here for. You and Thunderbolt have got this. I focused on the race, feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. I didn't need to carry Rachel's mistakes with me any longer. She was her own problem now. When it came time for the race, I mounted Thunderbolt, the familiar thrill rushing through me as I settled into the saddle. The crowd's noise faded into the background, and I could feel the power beneath me as Thunderbolt shifted, ready to run. I glanced over to the stands once, seeing Rachel there, but my heart felt steady, unmoved. The race itself was a blur, a heady mix of adrenaline, dirt, and the relentless pace of the horses pounding alongside us. I pushed Thunderbolt harder than I ever had, feeling him respond with everything he had. When we crossed that finish line, neck and neck with the other racers, I knew we'd given it our all. And for the first time since Rachel's betrayal, I felt something like peace. As the race wound down and the crowds began to disperse, I caught sight of Rachel again, looking hopeful, as if waiting for me to come to her, to say something that would erase what she'd done. But I had nothing left to give her. I walked past her without a word, and for the first time, I felt free. Dad was waiting by the trailer, arms crossed, a proud look in his eyes. Let's head back home, son. You've got a life waiting for you, one that doesn't need her. I nodded, feeling the finality in his words. We packed up, loaded the horses, and left that chapter behind. As we drove away, I didn't look back. The drive back home was quiet. Dad was behind the wheel, his face set in a calm expression, and I could tell he was letting me have my space. The long stretches of open road, the fields blurring by, gave me time to process everything that had happened. I could still feel the sting of Rachel's betrayal, but it was becoming a dull ache, something I could live with rather than a sharp, gnawing pain. As we pulled up to the ranch, the sight of it brought a sense of calm. The land, the horses, the familiar lines of the stables, it all felt steady, unchanging. This place had been here long before Rachel, and it would be here long after. It was my legacy, my life's work, and I realized I'd almost lost sight of that in the chaos she'd brought. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the work. Every day, I woke up with the dawn, feeding and caring for the horses, repairing the fences, taking on every task that needed doing. It was hard, physical labor, but I welcomed it. The soreness in my muscles was a reminder that I was moving forward, putting distance between myself and everything that had happened. Dad and I started to grow closer during that time. He'd always been a quiet man, but we'd fallen into an easy rhythm, talking about the horses, discussing new ideas for the ranch, and even making plans to expand the breeding program. I could see the pride in his eyes every time we made a decision together, a sign that he trusted me to carry on the work he'd started. Occasionally, I'd hear news from friends about Rachel, about how she tried to reach out to me, how she was struggling without the life we'd built together. But I pushed those thoughts aside, reminding myself of what Dad had said. She'd made her choice and I'd made mine. There was no going back. One evening, as we were finishing up in the stables, Dad clapped a hand on my shoulder, giving me a proud smile. "You've done well, son. Takes strength to walk away from something like that." I nodded, a weight lifting off my shoulders. It's what had to be done. I couldn't have built a life on something that broken. He nodded in agreement, his gaze distant for a moment, as if remembering something from his own past. Life has a way of testing us. Just remember, sometimes what seems like the end is just the start of something better. His words stayed with me. Maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter, a life where I was free to make my own choices without looking over my shoulder, without wondering if someone was betraying me. I spent the next few months focusing on the ranch, and little by little, I felt the weight of everything slip away. I found a strange sense of peace in the simplicity of it all. Life was about the land, the horses, and the quiet moments in between. I didn't need anything more than that. As the weeks turned into months, the ranch grew busier. We'd taken on new clients, started training a fresh batch of horses, and expanded our breeding program. I found myself caught up in the work, focused on making the ranch the best it could be. It was satisfying in a way that went beyond the day-to-day tasks. Each small accomplishment felt like a step forward, a reminder that I was building something solid, something that couldn't be taken away. Dad noticed the change in me, too. He'd give me that approving nod every now and I could see the pride in his eyes when we walked the property together, looking over the land that was now as much mine as it was his. It felt good, steady, purposeful, like I was becoming the man he'd always hoped I'd be. One day, while I was mending a fence along the back pasture, I spotted a figure in the distance. As they drew closer, I realized it was our neighbor Linda, who ran the farm just a few miles down the road. She was around my age, a hard worker with a quiet confidence that I'd always admired. We'd never been more than acquaintances, exchanging polite greetings here and there. But today, she looked different, almost hesitant as she approached. "Hey, Jack," she said, giving a small smile. "Thought I'd stop by and see if you needed a hand." I was a little taken aback, but managed to nod. "Sure, I wouldn't mind the company." As we worked, we talked about the usual things: ranch life, the challenges of running a farm, and the ups and downs of the past year. She didn't pry into my personal life, and I appreciated that. Instead, she talked about her own struggles, the work it took to keep her family's farm going, and how she'd had to make some hard decisions after her father passed. "I get it," I said, feeling an unexpected connection. "It's not easy, but there's something about this life that keeps us coming back, isn't there?" She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Yeah, I wouldn't trade it for anything." For the first time in months, I found myself opening up, talking about my own dreams for the ranch, the ideas Dad and I had been working on. Linda listened intently, and her presence had a calming effect, like talking to an old friend who understood without needing all the details. When she finally left, I felt a strange sense of contentment. It was a simple conversation, nothing more, but it reminded me that life was full of possibilities. There was a future waiting for me, one that didn't have to be defined by the past. In the days that followed, I kept busy, but Linda's visit stayed on my mind. I found myself looking forward to the times we'd cross paths, those brief moments when we'd share a few words or simply nod in acknowledgement. It was as if a new door had opened, one that hinted at a life beyond the routines I'd grown accustomed to. One evening, as Dad and I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he turned to me, his face thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Jack. I know it hasn't been easy, but I'm proud of the man you're becoming." I nodded, letting his words sink in. "Thanks, Dad. I think I'm finally starting to see what you meant all those months ago. About moving on, letting go." He smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Life's funny that way. Sometimes, you don't see the path ahead until you've left the past behind." As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this new chapter held more than I'd ever imagined. The ranch, my family, the land. They were constants, steady and unchanging. But within that steady life, I'd found the strength to stand on my own again. And for the first time, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.